All right, welcome back to another episode of the What's the Big Idea podcast. And Rob is at camp this week, so he is not here. So it is me and Pastor Matt. Rob was the one preaching. That's why I said he is not here, because usually it'd be like if Eric preached, it'd be him. If you preached, obviously it's usually you're
Yeah.
here. But Rob, he's at camp this week, so he is not here for the sermon he preached to do
Left us hanging.
follow up with. So I will be saying the big idea, which is God's power is shown in the protection He provides. I think that's very close.
I think it's close enough.
I was about to swap the God's power is provided and the protection He provides.
The alliteration
that
got
doubles
to
up. Yeah.
The sermon was about God's power and protection.
Yes, specifically in Psalms 27.
Yes, Psalm
so
27.
Rob in his sermon clarified that God's power is everywhere, a lot of places, but specifically we're looking at Psalms 27, a Psalm of David, and it's talking about God's protection over David and God's power in that. So I think that's how it should be said.
Yeah, well done.
But so one of the big questions people ask is, why do bad things happen to good people? Specifically, kind of how I'm going to ask it is, if God protects those who believe in Him, why do bad things happen to those people? And even with that happening to them, is God still a refuge that we can go to whenever He does allow those bad things to happen?
Yeah, I think that's the very first question that probably pops in most people's minds if they read a psalm like this. If they're going through a difficult time, or they've just been through a difficult time, or know someone who is, there's this sense of, well, I think for the believer, there's a sense of saying, well, I know that this is true, but I'm still struggling with this. For the non-believer, they read this psalm and they're like, okay, that's not true, because of this. Well, what about that? That skeptic attitude. I think to answer that question, the first thing we need to do is remember the context, right? This is a psalm of David. David's life was anything but a cakewalk. Everything in David's life, for the most part, was hard. God allowed, and some of it at no fault of his own, right?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, we can throw rocks. We have a friend who's joined us for the podcast.
Flies everywhere.
Timothy and Daniel called. That's a fly, by the way, for the viewer at home. Timothy and Daniel, my twin boys, they call those bees. Yeah, they say bee. And nonetheless, I think we have to remember David's context first. David's life was hard, difficult. David went through some very, well, to use, I guess, the terminology, he went through some very unsafe, like dangerous times.
Mm-hmm.
Some of them were brought about by himself, right? His sin obviously led to Absalom's rebellion and all of that. But let's focus on the first half of David's life. Goliath coming out in the middle of the Kidron Valley was not David's fault, right? David's in an unsafe situation because God put him there. When Rob, I don't want to call him Paul, because I was thinking of Saul. And Rob wasn't chunking spears either. He was talking about Saul throwing spears. I'm struggling. When Rob talked about Saul throwing those spears at David, right? That wasn't David's fault. When David's fleeing from the Philistines as he's in the wilderness and fighting the Philistines, not David's fault. So God allows David to go through all those things. That's my point. The difficult situations David is writing about here, David is walking in the middle of God's will, and he's facing difficulties. And that reminds me of a quote. I don't remember where I first heard this, but the quote goes like this, that the safest place to be is in the center of God's will. Now, on one hand, you say, well, being in God's will is not always safe. You think about the missionary who's serving in a foreign context, like in a closed country where they're not allowed to share the gospel openly, or a believer who's being martyred for their faith. Like we have examples all throughout history and in the scriptures of faithful people who trusted in God's power and protection and died. Let's look at the New Testament. Look at Stephen. Did Stephen trust in God's power and protection? Absolutely. And what happened? He got stoned to death.
I was thinking who you were calling out earlier, Paul.
Yeah.
I mean, he had a very tough life.
For sure.
But he used that as an example of
Exactly.
he even on the boat, whenever the boat gets destroyed, he's still proclaiming God's name.
For sure.
Whenever bad things are happening, but everyone got saved.
So ask those
Or
guys.
didn't die.
Well, yeah,
That's what I mean.
Paul got saved. David here in this situation gets spared. Stephen did not, right? So did God protect them in those situations? Was God faithful to them? Sometimes God allows us to go through difficult times because that brings him greater glory than if we go through a time of ease and, comfort. But I think if you asked Paul, hey, was God's power, let's quote a Bible verse here, 2 Corinthians. Paul talks about some of the hardships he goes through, and what does he say? He says, God's power was perfected in my weakness, So he even almost verbatim would say God's power was displayed even in his hardships. David talks about that here as well. And so I think we just have to be careful that we don't say, for God to truly be powerful, he has to protect us from everything that's bad. That's not the picture. Sometimes God allows us to go through difficult things because he loves us and he uses those things to deepen our faith. But even in them, and I think that's the message here of this psalm, David is writing this psalm in this season, and he's saying, God, you're my protector in this season. You're not protecting me from it, you're protecting me in it. And there's a difference there.
Yeah. Speaking of God protecting him in it, God is kind of at the front line of our protection versus Rob's, his soccer illustration of having two friends who if he was mouthing off on the soccer field, he'd have two people to back him up. God is the one going forward, and so we can have confidence in him instead of, as Rob said, like being cocky. You can do that because you'll have some backup.
Right.
But in God's sense, he's going forward. He's the front line. He's not backup for us. So we should have confidence in his protection. And so what does that balance between confidence and cocky and all of that look like to you?
Yeah. Rob talked about that illustration, right? The soccer player, Rob running his mouth. That's what he said. I've seen Rob in competitive environments. I've seen that side of him. But no, he talked about, knowing that people had his back, right? He had the ability to move forward in probably a cocky way rather than just a confident way. And I think we have to be careful that we don't do that with God. Again, we talk about context. We don't want to take, let's look at Psalm 27. The Lord is my light and my salvation. Whom shall I fear? The Lord is the stronghold of my life. Of whom shall I be afraid? Right? Okay, well, we can take that at face value and say God's our protector. But what we don't want to do is take that out of context and say, that means I can do whatever I want to do. That means I can jump off this cliff and God's going to protect me. As I was listening to Rob Sunday, the thought, as he was talking about that, I was reminded of Matthew 4. Jesus and his temptation in the wilderness, Satan comes and tempts Jesus. And one of the temptations that Satan tempts Jesus with is he takes them up on the pinnacle of the temple and he tells them, hey, if you're Jesus or if you're the Son of God, why don't you jump off of the temple? Because the Bible says that God will command his angels to catch you and won't let you dash your foot against a stone. And it's that very thing, right? Well, are you powerful or not? Well, let's see it. Is God going to show power or not? Let's see it. And Jesus responds by saying, don't put the Lord your God to the test. I think there are some people who look at a psalm like this and say, well, this means I can do whatever I want to do and God's going to protect me. And that's not the context, right? The context is, as we're walking faithfully with God, that he is going to be with us and that he will show his power in those situations. It's not I don't know. I often say this, faith is not the same thing as foolishness. Now, sometimes a step of faith can look foolish, like the world will not understand our faith in God. But having faith in God doesn't mean we intentionally go do foolish things to prove God. You know what I mean? And so I think that's the difference between confidence and cockiness. I can have confidence that if God calls me to do something that doesn't make sense or that people say there's no way that's going to work, well, no, God's led me here and I can confidently trust in him that he's going to have my back. But that's different than me saying, I'm going to go jump into this mess just to show off, or to try to Oh, because I'm a Christian and God's on my side, I can do whatever. There's a big difference between those two things.
So we've been talking about protection and God's protection and his protection for all people of, who trust in him. Wasn't that part of one of the verses was kind of in order to kind of get God's protection, you got it takes someone seeking after him
Mm-hmm.
and then knowing that there's got to be someone out there greater than us who will protect us, kind of.
Yeah.
At least that's how in my head I kind of see it. But do you think that there are some people who God won't protect if they call upon him?
That's a good question. I think about that in two ways. And I want to be careful not to, Lord help me, I never want to say anything that's not biblically accurate.
Mhm.
So I want to try to provide some biblical examples here all on the fly. Let me answer that first of all from the believer standpoint. The believer who says, how do I phrase this? Have you ever had a time in your life where when something bad happens to you, your first thought is, well, I did something to deserve that?
Mhm.
Like my tire went flat. Like it's probably because I had that bad thought yesterday, right? We naturally equate bad things that happen in our lives to, well, God's paying me back for something. Does that make sense?
Mhm.
I think a lot of people wrestle with that. And so to answer your question in that sense of, well, like, does God always protect us? I think for the believer, the answer is yes. We don't have to walk around saying, well, like I wasn't perfect today, so God's hand of protection is now not on me anymore. And you know what I mean? Like God doesn't call us to live in that sense of fear or, he's not expecting us to live this perfect life and earn his protection. That we need to understand that God in his grace protects us as we put our faith and hope in him, even if we're not walking in absolute perfection. Again, David's a great example of this. David's not a perfect man, but God showed his protection for David and showed his grace in a lot of ways. So I want to be careful that we don't in any way lead someone to say, for God to show his power and protect you, you've got to just be jam up 100% perfect. Not a biblical truth. At the same time, and this is where I will counter that with a second group of people, I do think knowing God and seeking him are prerequisites to walking under his protection. David writes this psalm and he talks about, Lord, one thing I've asked, I seek that I may dwell in your house all of my days to gaze upon your beauty, for he will hide me in his shelter in the day of trouble. He will conceal me under the cover of his tent. He will lift me high upon a rock. So David says, I'm seeking you, and in your presence is where I find my protection. So if someone is not seeking God, how can they walk under his protection, right? Now, what about the non-believer who calls out to God and says, I want to put my faith in you, please save me? You hear these, Lord, it's the guy in the storm on the boat who says, Lord, if you'll save me from this storm, I'm going to follow you, right? And God saves them and they put their faith in him. You hear those stories all the time. I do think there's a difference, but even that, right? I mean, is that a prayer of faith? Is that someone putting their faith in God? At its most basic sense, I think you could say yes. Is it a mature faith? Is it a full faith? No, but it's still faith, right? It's still, to your point, it's recognizing there's a higher power than me and I don't have any hope and I'm trusting in you to save me. But the Bible also talks about, I'm leading a study in second Psalms. Yeah. Second Psalms does not exist. I was leading a study in 2 Samuel, and David makes this prayer where he says, Lord, these people cry out to you. Don't listen to their prayer. And the reason he says that is because they're wicked people who are using the name of God, not in faith, but they're using it just to try to get something. And we all know people like that, right? Who they'll pray to God just to get something out of him. And Rob even made a point. I forget how he said it, but something along the lines of, whenever we seek God, like the greatest blessing is not what we get from him, it's God himself. And so all that to say, does God always hear people's call for protection, and does he always respond? I think there is a prerequisite for you must seek him and know him, but that doesn't mean that you have to walk in this perfect sinlessness to earn his protection either. I think we need to understand both of those are dangerous ideas, both of those extremes. But here's the good news: in His grace, God does offer protection even when we don't deserve it. You know, why does the non-believer walk away from a car wreck and is unscathed? Well, it's just a picture of God's grace, right? Why does a believer die in a car wreck when they've put their faith in God? Does that mean God is not fair? And, that gets back to our first question, right? Does this mean that God's always going to keep us from dangerous situations? No, it doesn't. Sometimes God is greater glorified whenever he allows us to go through difficulties. So those two questions really kind of go hand in hand, honestly, when you think about it.
Yeah, and I think that something kind of added on, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, but I mean, even in situations of where people have even died because of something, but in the end, God ends up getting more glory for it.
Correct.
I mean, every person, we're not guaranteed a certain age, and so our time that was our time, and it's not like they did that, and then a skeptic might look at it and be like, oh, see, God didn't protect them, but
right.
In reality, it's just that was God's chosen time for that person.
Yep.
And that was their kind of planned life.
Well, you think about it too.
Life.
I've often shared this. What's the worst thing that can happen to a believer? I mean, our earthly death is often what we think of, right? Well, all that is God allowing us to enter into glory, and that's better than anything this world can ever offer. So, does God not protect that person who dies in faithfulness to Him? Well, no. If anything, He welcomes them into His presence and rewards them, right? So, it's not a bad thing. The world looks at it as a bad thing. Yeah. The world says, "Well, aha, God, you didn't protect him like you said." Well, but look at Jesus. I mean, what happens to him? He dies on the cross, right? And what did they say? What was the accusation on the cross? Everybody's around him saying, "Where's God? I thought you were his son. Why isn't God protecting you? If God loves you, He'll save you." And Jesus knew that there was something greater, right? There was a greater picture of God's glory that was going to be displayed. So I just think we have to see in the context of Scripture that God does allow His followers, even the most faithful of followers, to go through times of difficulty. And I think in those times we have to question, all right, Lord, is my faith really in you or not? Here's another biblical example. We all know the story of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, right? Which, by the way, that's their Babylonian names. I don't know why we call them by their Babylonian names, but do you remember their Hebrew names?
I think I can remember two of them. But it kind of says their Babylonian names.
It does.
More because I guess that's what they ended.
And that's what we know.
Probably ended their life with.
But yeah, Hananiah, Azariah, and Mishael are the three.
I probably actually wouldn't have gotten those.
But nonetheless, those three friends, right, in the book of Daniel, they're thrown to the fiery furnace, right, because they didn't bow down to the golden statue. And do you remember what they say when Nebuchadnezzar basically says, "Hey, I'm going to throw you into the fire if you don't bow"? And they say, "Well, we don't care. We're not going to bow because we believe that God can save us from this fire," right? So God's power is shown in His protection. We believe that God can save us. But even if He doesn't, we're still not going to bow down. And I think that's where we have to come to as a believer. We can read this psalm and say, "Lord, I trust in you to protect me. As I faithfully follow you, I'm trusting that you're going to protect me. But even if you don't, I know you have a purpose in that, and I'm still going to trust you because you're still God."
I think that's where part of the confidence versus cockiness can come into. Because if they just left it at that first part, oh, God can protect me.
Right.
In their heart, they may be thinking that, but to the world, it kind of looks like they're being a little bit cocky, like, oh, God will protect me just because. But then they say, but even if you don't, then that leads to the confidence of, well, God's at the forefront of it, not He's kind of our backup, but He's at the forefront. He will protect us. But if He doesn't, that's His choice.
Yeah. And that's where faith comes in, right? We take God at His word, and these are promises. We can trust His promises. But if it doesn't work out, sometimes we misinterpret those promises. And God is still faithful, even if things don't work out the way that we think they should, right? To us, when we think God's power and protection, we have our own mindset of thinking, here's how that's manifested. That means I never get sick. It means tragedy never happens to me. I'm happy, healthy, and, live a long life, and that's God keeping his promise. Not at all. That's our very self-centered idea of God keeping his promise to protect us. But really, sometimes it gets manifested in different ways, as we see in these scriptural accounts.
I think kind of you talking about that, and you kind of mentioned it a little bit earlier, but one of Rob's points was we ask for God to do these things and protect us and stuff, and we get a reward from that. But the true reward is not God giving us stuff or God protecting us from stuff, but the real reward is that he offers us his fellowship and that we can know and communicate with the one true God who does offer a lot of those other rewards, but they're not guaranteed, if that makes sense. Like the main thing is of his reward to us is his fellowship.
It's him. Yeah, for sure. As you were talking about that too, God's protection, and I forget how Rob said it, but as you were mentioning that, it reminded me of something else. A lot of times people, we seek God's protection, or we ask God to protect us when we're doing something. Here's the classic example. Lord, as we're about to go on this vacation, would you, keep us safe, right? Like we pray before we hit the road. God bless us as we go on this vacation, right? And that's good. That's a good prayer. There's nothing wrong with that prayer. We pray that prayer. At the same time, I think we sometimes get it backwards by saying, Lord, I'm going to do this, whether you have called me to or not. And so I'm going to do this. And by the way, would you protect me while I do this? Instead of saying, Lord, help me to do your will, and trust that as I'm doing your will, you're going to protect me as you call me, as you've said you would. Does that make sense? It's the whole God bless my plans versus God help me to be obedient to your plan and trust your promises in the midst of that. I think this is a good reminder as we think about this topic. This isn't so much a call to say, pray these magic prayers that God blesses you and protects you, as much as it is to say, as I'm seeking God and pursuing him, God promises to take care of me. That's the message.
Well, is there any other points that you think you'd like to make or add on to Rob's sermon, since he's not here to defend his sermon himself?
We need Rob's input, man. Rob can go back and watch this and chime into the comments and provide his corrections and commentary. But no, I appreciate him preaching Sunday. I will say my one critique. I mean, man, how do you not know it's Father's Day? And even this psalm, verse 10, my father and mother have forsaken me, but the Lord will take me in. I mean, the whole thing was on a tee for him, and he missed it.
I mean, kind of the week leading up to Father's Day, I wasn't really thinking about Father's Day either until Saturday.
Yeah, I will say, kind of a little bit of background for those who wonder, how do these sermon series come together? I intentionally set Psalm 27 for Father's Day because I felt like it had a very good connection, even in that verse.
So you didn't give him the heads up?
I guess Rob missed that, and I may not have communicated that as clearly as I should have. But nonetheless, a good Father's Day message and a good message for any day. And I'm thankful for the Lord's power, and I'm thankful for the way He offers protection, even when we don't deserve it.
Oh, I got one small other thing. So I don't really look at the pastor's bulletins too often, just because I working kind of behind the scenes.
Yeah, you're talking about the notes,
the digital stuff that I just kind of put with things, but I don't really look at them too much. So do you have your how he had the H45,
the actual
1-8, or
no,
you don't put those in yours?
I don't. No, he gave the Strong's number, I guess, for that. Which
I mean, I went and Googled it, and it popped up with the first link. I think was Bible Reference.
Okay,
something.
I got you.
But there was a couple others in that used that same number. I don't know how that
honestly
works.
When I saw HB something, that's the same House bill number. If you look up the political bills, if it's a House bill, it starts with HB and then the numbers. But that was where my mind went first. But Yes. Good for Rob. He did include his Hebrew reference.
So I was going to say, he went up, Joe. He said he had to include the word, and then he had a little bit of something extra.
Good job.
All right. Well, thank y'all so much for listening in. Hopefully you learned something, or
maybe so.
At least enjoyed the conversation.
Yes.
And with that, we'll see you. Well, what are we doing next week? Because we do have VBS, so
we do. We'll find a way.
Okay.
We'll find a way to record.
All right.
Yes.
Well, then we'll see you next week.
See you next week.